after the river took my friend. The mountains became very quiet. Too quiet. Every morning I woke up expecting to hear Tommy laughing near the river. But the only sound left was the wind moving through the trees. I stopped talking, stopped working. Even the gold in the river no longer mattered. The valley that once felt alive now felt empty. Days passed, then weeks. Winter slowly began to arrive in the mountains. One evening the cold was worse than usual. The sky was dark and the forest was silent. I was sitting alone inside my small cabin, staring into the fire, wondering how long a man could live like this. That's when I heard something outside. A small sound. Scratch, scratch. At the door. At first I thought it was the wind. But then I heard it again. Slowly I stood up and opened the door. Standing there in the snow was a dog. A thin golden dog. His fur was wet and tangled. His ribs showed through his skin. And his eyes looked just as lost as I felt. For a moment we simply stared at each other. Two creatures alone in the cold mountains. I knelt down and held out my hand. He didn't bark. He didn't run. Instead he walked forward slowly, and leaned his head against my arm. That night I gave him the last piece of meat I had. I dried his fur beside the fire, and for the first time since losing my friend, I didn't feel completely alone. I named him Rusty, and from that night on, Rusty never left my side. Sometimes I think, I didn't find that dog. That dog found me. The winter that came after that autumn was the hardest winter of my life. The mountains became white and silent. Snow covered the river. The wind howled through the trees like something alive. Food became harder to find. The cold cut through everything. Even the fire inside the cabin struggled to stay alive. Rusty and I stayed close to the cabin most days. But one morning a terrible storm rolled over the mountains. The sky turned dark. The wind began to scream through the valley. Snow fell so hard that I could barely see the trees. I tried to return to the cabin, but the storm had already swallowed the trail. Within minutes the mountains disappeared. All I could see was white snow and violent wind. I realized something terrifying. I was lost. The cold began creeping into my hands and feet. The wind pushed against my body like it wanted to throw me into the valley. For the first time in years, I thought I might die in those mountains. But Rusty kept moving. The dog barked and ran ahead of me, stopping and looking back as if telling me to follow. Step by step we pushed through the storm. My legs felt heavy. My breath burned in the freezing air. Then through the snow I saw something. A faint yellow glow. The light from my cabin window. Rusty had led me home. That night I sat beside the fire with my dog sleeping next to me. Outside the storm raged across the mountains. And I realized something. Gold may keep a man working, but sometimes it's a loyal dog that keeps him alive. That winter changed everything. Before Rusty came into my life, the mountains felt empty. After losing Tommy, I had stopped caring about almost everything. The river no longer sounded beautiful. The forest felt too quiet. Even the fire in the cabin seemed colder somehow. But that dog, that stubborn golden dog, brought something back into my life that I thought I had lost forever. The first few days Rusty stayed very close to the cabin. He followed me everywhere. If I stepped outside to chop wood, he sat nearby watching. If I walked to the river, he walked beside me. And every night he slept near the fire, his head resting on his paws, always keeping one eye open. At first I thought he might leave. Dogs that wander in the mountains often do. But Rusty never left. In fact, it almost seemed like he had made a promise to stay. Days slowly turned into weeks. The snow grew deeper around the valley. Food was harder to find. But Rusty helped more than I expected. One morning while I was checking a trap line, Rusty suddenly froze and stared toward the trees. Then he ran ahead. At first I thought he had chased a rabbit. But when I followed him into the forest, I realized something surprising. Rusty had found a deer trail. Not far ahead, a small deer stood between the trees. That day we had food again. From that moment I realized Rusty was more than just a companion. He was a survivor. just like me. And in the mountains, survivors learn to trust each other. The winter nights were long. Sometimes the wind would howl so loudly around the cabin that the walls trembled. On those nights, I would sit beside the fire with Rusty lying near my boots. I often talked to him like he was an old friend. Maybe that sounds strange. But when you live alone in the wilderness, silence can become heavy. Talking helps keep your thoughts from drifting too far into the dark. I told him about Tommy, about the river, about the day everything changed. Rusty never interrupted. He just listened. Sometimes he lifted his head and looked at me as if he understood every word. Maybe he did. Animals understand grief better than most people. Spring eventually arrived. The snow began to melt. The river grew louder again as the ice broke apart and rushed downstream. For the first time since the accident, I walked back to the riverbank. Rusty stayed close beside me. The water was calmer now, but I still felt the memory of that terrible day. For a long time, I simply stood there staring at the current. Rusty sat quietly next to me. Then he placed his paw on my boot. Just for a moment. It was a small gesture, but somehow it felt like permission to move forward. After that day, something inside me slowly began to heal. Rusty and I started working the river again. Some days we found small flakes of gold. Other days the pan showed nothing but sand. But it didn't matter as much anymore, because the mountains no longer felt empty. I had a partner again, and Rusty proved his loyalty many times after that. One evening near sunset, I slipped while crossing a wet rock beside the river. The current grabbed my leg and nearly pulled me in. Before I could even react, Rusty grabbed the back of my coat with his teeth and pulled. Hard. Just enough to break the current's grip. If he hadn't done that, I might have followed Tommy into that river. After that day, I realized something important. Sometimes the mountains take someone from you, but sometimes they send someone else to keep you going. Years passed in that valley. Rusty grew stronger. His golden fur shined in the sunlight. Travelers who passed through the mountains often stopped to talk. Most of them remembered the dog before they remembered me. Rusty had a way of making people smile. And maybe that's exactly what I needed. A reminder that life could still be warm, even after loss. Now, when I sit here beside this fire and look back on those years, I don't remember only the sorrow. I remember the quiet mornings, the sound of the river, the smoke rising from the cabin chimney, and the loyal dog who refused to let a broken man stay broken. Sometimes people ask me what the greatest treasure I ever found in those mountains was. They expect me to talk about gold. But the truth is much simpler than that. The greatest treasure I ever found. Walked to my cabin one cold winter night. Hungry, lost, and looking for a friend. And in the end, that dog didn't just save my life. He gave me my life back. Life in the mountains slowly found its rhythm again. Rusty and I woke up early every morning. The first light of the sun would slip through the tall pine trees and touch the roof of the cabin. The air always smelled fresh, cold, and clean. Some mornings there was mist hanging above the river like a quiet ghost drifting across the valley. Those were my favorite mornings. Rusty would run ahead along the trail, stopping every few steps to make sure I was still behind him. It didn't take long before the whole valley started to feel different. Not empty anymore, just quiet. And quiet is not always loneliness. Sometimes quiet is peace. One morning something strange happened. Rusty suddenly stopped beside the riverbank and started barking. Not the way he barked when he saw a deer. This bark was different. Sharp. Warning. I walked over and looked at the ground. Fresh footprints. Human footprints. That was unusual. Very few people came this deep into the mountains. Rusty kept staring toward the forest. I followed the direction of his gaze. And then I saw him. A man standing between the trees. He looked exhausted. His clothes were dusty and worn. For a moment neither of us spoke. Out here in the wilderness, you learn to study people carefully before saying anything. Finally, he stepped forward slowly. Didn't expect to find anyone living this far out, he said. His voice sounded tired. Like a man who had been walking for days. I offered him some water and invited him to sit near the fire. Rusty stayed close to my side the entire time, watching the stranger carefully. The man told me he had been traveling through the mountains searching for gold, just like we once had, just like Tommy and Elias and I. Listening to him brought back memories I hadn't thought about in a long time. The stranger asked if the river still held gold. I looked toward the water. The current moved calmly now, sunlight reflecting off its surface. There's always a little gold in the river, I said, but the mountains charge a price for it. He laughed quietly. I didn't. After a while, the man thanked me for the food and continued on his way down the valley. Rusty watched him disappear into the trees. And for a moment I realized something. Life had quietly continued. Even after everything that had happened. New people would come. New stories would begin. And the mountains would remain the same. That evening I sat beside the river with Rusty resting near my boots. The water moved gently over the stones. Nothing like the raging storm from years before. But the memory was still there. Memories don't disappear. They simply become quieter over time. Rusty looked up at me and wagged his tail. I smiled and scratched behind his ears. You know something, old friend, I said. This place almost broke me once. Rusty tilted his head as if listening. But it also gave me something I never expected. A loyal companion. A second chance. And the understanding that even after the hardest loss, life can still find its way back to you. The sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. The sky turned deep orange and purple. Smoke drifted gently from the cabin chimney. Rusty stood up and stretched. It was time to go home. As we walked back along the trail, I looked once more toward the river. For a long time I believed that river had taken everything from me. But now I understood something different. It had taken one chapter of my life and opened another. And sometimes, the story that comes after loss is the one that teaches you how to live again. After the stranger left the valley, life returned to its quiet rhythm. Rusty and I continued working near the river. Days passed peacefully. Too peacefully. In the mountains, peace rarely lasts forever. One evening the sky began to change. Dark clouds slowly rolled over the peaks. The air became heavy and cold. Old prospectors learned to recognize that feeling. A storm was coming. Rusty sensed it before I did. The dog stood near the cabin door, staring toward the forest. His ears lifted, his body tense. Then the wind arrived. First a whisper, then a roar. Snow began falling across the valley like white dust. Within an hour, the mountains disappeared behind a wall of snow. The storm grew violent. Wind slammed against the cabin walls. The chimney rattled. The fire inside struggled to stay alive. Rusty lay beside the door, watching the darkness outside. Then suddenly he stood up, his ears straight. A low growl rolled from his throat. At first I heard nothing but the wind. But then, a long, distant sound. A howl. Then another. Wolves. Rusty barked sharply. The howls grew closer. Outside, shapes moved between the trees. For maybe 5 wolves. The storm had driven them down from the higher mountains. And hungry wolves in winter are dangerous. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside the cabin. The wind cut through my coat like a knife. The wolves circled slowly at the edge of the trees. Their eyes reflected the lantern light. For a moment everything went silent. Just the storm. And the animals watching from the darkness. Rusty stood beside me, barking fiercely. The wolves hesitated. They weren't afraid, but they were careful. Finally, the largest wolf stepped forward. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed across the valley. The pack paused. Then slowly, one by one, they disappeared back into the storm. I stayed outside for several minutes, making sure they were gone. Rusty never left my side. When we finally returned inside the cabin, the storm continued raging outside. But something strange happened the next morning. The storm had uncovered part of the riverbank. And in the fresh gravel left behind by the rushing water, I saw something shining. Gold. Real gold. the biggest piece I had ever found in that valley. I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight in my hand. For a long moment I simply stared at it. Years ago, that discovery would have made me shout with joy. But this time I only smiled quietly, because I finally understood something. Gold may bring a man to the mountains, but it's the things he finds along the way, loyalty, survival, and unexpected friendships, that truly change his life. Rusty wagged his tail beside me as if he already knew that. The storm slowly faded as the morning sun rose over the mountains. The valley was quiet again. Fresh snow covered the ground, and the river flowed calmly beside the trees. Rusty walked ahead of me, his paws leaving small tracks in the snow. I stood there for a moment holding the piece of gold in my hand. It was the largest nugget I had ever found in this valley. Years ago, something like this would have meant everything to me. Back then, I believed gold was the reason I came to the mountains. But standing there in the cold morning light, I realized something had changed. The mountains had already given me something far more valuable. They had taken a friend from me, but they had also sent me another. I looked down at Rusty. The dog wagged his tail and looked up at me as if he already understood. Sometimes life takes something away, and sometimes it quietly gives something back. Rusty had found me when I was at my lowest, lost, alone, and slowly disappearing inside my own grief. But that loyal dog refused to let me stay that way. Together we survived the winter, the storms, and even the wolves. I placed the gold nugget in my pocket and looked out across the valley. The mountains stood silent and endless around us. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel alone in that silence. Rusty barked softly and started walking back toward the cabin. I followed behind him through the snow. The smoke from the chimney rose slowly into the cold morning air. And as I stepped back into the warmth of the cabin, I realized something simple but important. Gold may bring a man to the mountains, but loyalty, friendship, and the quiet strength to keep living, those are the treasures that truly matter. Rusty curled up beside the fire as the flames slowly grew brighter. Outside, the valley rested peacefully after the storm. And for the first time since losing my friend, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace.